There is one myth in the history of design, a sacred cow, a place spoken of only in reverent whispers. Its name is Red House. We are told it was the cradle of a revolution. The first honest house built by William Morris as a paradise on earth. A palace of arts meant to declare war on industrial filth and soulless machines. That is the official story, and it is a lie. If this was paradise, why did it last only 5 years? Why did Morris, its creator, flee the house, ruined and broken? Why did a project born of friendship end in betrayal and silence? And why did the ideal home turn into a financial abyss and an emotional prison for its creator? But the main, most uncomfortable question art critics ignore is, where did the money come from? We will reveal the paradox. This anti-industrial masterpiece was built with the dirtiest money in Victorian England. This was a utopia paid for by the very system it was meant to destroy. The official story is a facade covered in roses, but behind it are cracks, obsession, and personal tragedy. What really happened within the walls of Red House? And what dark truth about the price of utopia had to be buried under layers of wallpaper and fame? The official history of Red House is a lie. It's a convenient, romantic myth about a lone genius, William Morris, the father of the arts and crafts movement, waging a personal war against the Industrial Revolution. But this myth isn't just an inaccuracy, it's a deliberate erasure, it's a cover-up. The truth? Morris didn't even design it. The blueprints were drawn by another man, one conveniently pushed into the footnotes, Philip Webb. This was Webb's very first independent commission. Morris was the soul, the romantic with dreams of a medieval utopia. Webb was the practical engineer, the only one who could anchor those impossible dreams in the reality of brick and timber. But the cover-up goes deeper. This wasn't a duo, it was an unstable commune. The myth of the lone creator completely erases the collective that actually brought this house to life. Red House became a laboratory for the entire Pre-Raphaelite brotherhood. Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Edward Burne-Jones, Ford Madox Brown, and their wives. They didn't just visit, they consumed the house, covering its walls with murals, designing stained glass, and building furniture with their own hands. This was not a home, it was a headquarters, a palace of arts. Disgusted by the monstrously ugly modern world, Morris made a radical decision. If civilization was corrupt, they would build their own from scratch. This house was meant to be the prototype for a new, pure society. This wasn't just collaboration. It was the experiment that became the foundation for Morris's legendary design firm. The house was the lab where the company's principles were first tested. And this is where the beautiful story collapses. A project built on friendship is uniquely vulnerable to the fracturing of that friendship. A utopia funded from one man's wallet creates unbearable pressure. The official story is a triumph. The truth is a complex, fragile, and ultimately doomed attempt to build a shared paradise, one that would end in betrayal and escape. A paradise like this couldn't be built just anywhere. The location wasn't a choice, it was a declaration of war against the 19th century. The battleground Morris selected was a quiet patch of land in Kent, far from the smog and filth of industrial London, a city he called a spreading sore. This was an escape, a purification, an attempt to find a piece of England the machine had not yet devoured. But don't be fooled by the practical explanations. Yes, it was a manageable commute to his London offices. That's the convenient alibi. But the true motive for choosing this specific field wasn't about practicality. It was about magic. The site was chosen for its ghost. The land was situated directly on the ancient Watling Street, the old Roman road, immortalized by Chaucer, that pilgrims walked to Canterbury. This was not a coincidence. This was a deliberate act of historical necromancy. Morris wasn't just building a house. He was attempting to anchor his utopia in a purer, mystical timeline. He wasn't just rejecting his present, he was trying to resurrect a medieval past. The proof is carved into the architecture itself. The main hallway, running from the front door to the back, was named the Pilgrim's Rest. He wasn't building a home, he was building a shrine on a mythical map. The ground itself was the first manifesto. The philosophical fortifications were set. The only question was what kind of fortress this haunted land demanded, a home or a fortress? The answer reveals the central motivation behind Red House. It had to be both. It was designed as a fortress to protect a very specific, fragile idea of what a home could be. The driving force was not merely architectural, it was a desperate, romantic crusade to build an earthly paradise in a world that seemed determined to pave over Eden. The central mystery begins with a paradox. William Morris was a man of considerable wealth, able to afford the finest goods the British Empire could produce. Yet, upon his marriage to Jane Burden, as he sought to furnish a home, he discovered a terrifying void. The market offered him nothing. Nothing he considered honest, beautiful, or worthy of a human life. It was all a monstrous parade of machine-made ornamentation, cheap materials disguised as luxury, and a complete absence of soul. This was not a simple matter of taste. It was a profound moral and philosophical crisis. What does a man do when the entire material culture of his civilization is an insult to the human spirit? Morris's answer was an act of total rebellion. He decided that if the world could not offer him a single well-made chair, a single honest table, or a single beautiful textile, then he and his friends would have to remake the world themselves, starting with one house. This decision was the true genesis of the arts and crafts movement. It was not an intellectual theory born in a university, it was a practical necessity born in a construction site. Red House became a laboratory. Every single element, from the massive built-in settles and cupboards designed by Webb to the stained glass windows and sprawling murals painted by Burne-Jones and Rossetti, was a protest. Each handcrafted object was a vote against the factory. This process of collective creation led directly, almost accidentally, to the founding of Morris, Marshall, Faulkner and Cummins in 1861. The firm was not a pre-planned business venture. It was the logical and necessary continuation of the work started at Red House. The house was the crucible, the proof of concept. Having created a total work of art for themselves, they realized they had also created a new model for production that they could offer to others. But the ultimate goal went far beyond commerce. The deepest motivation was the creation of a community. Morris's medieval ideal was not just about pointed arches and handcrafted goods, it was about the fellowship that he believed such an environment would foster. Red House was designed to be the physical vessel for a shared life of art, friendship, and collaborative work. It was an attempt to resurrect a lost way of being. This was the core of the utopian dream, a house that would not only be a work of art, but would actively shape the lives of those within it, turning them into a cohesive, creative brotherhood, a beautiful machine for living beautifully. But any machine is defined by its design, its external form, and its internal mechanics. So let us examine that architectural skin. A building's exterior is never neutral. It is a public broadcast, a statement of intent directed at the world. And in the case of Red House, every single brick was a carefully chosen word in a declaration of war against the prevailing tastes and values of its time. The first shot was fired with its name. Why was a building simply called Red House so revolutionary? Because in an era of pale, stuccoed villas, where the goal was to cover the structural reality of a building with a smooth, respectable facade, Webb and Morris did the unthinkable. They left the red brick exposed for all to see. This was an act of aggressive honesty, a moral statement that the beauty of a house should reside in its true materials and honest construction, not in a decorative lie. The style itself was a calculated act of historical defiance. It was neo-Gothic, but not the ornate, academic Gothic revival popular at the time. This was a simplified, muscular interpretation, inspired by the unpretentious vernacular architecture of 13th century Britain. It was Gothic in spirit, not in slavish detail. It sought to capture the soul of medieval craftsmanship, not just copy its forms. And then there is the shape. The house is not a symmetrical, classical box designed to impose order on the landscape. It is an L-shaped, asymmetrical building that seems to have grown organically from the ground. Its high chimneys and steep, sweeping roof of red tiles create a dramatic, almost jagged silhouette against the sky. As Dante Gabriel Rossetti famously remarked, it was more a poem than a house, designed to evoke a feeling, not to impress with formal grandeur. But the most radical, most telling piece of evidence is the placement of the windows. For centuries, the design of a facade was an exercise in balanced composition. Windows were placed symmetrically for external effect, even if it meant a room's interior was compromised. Red House shatters this principle. The windows are placed precisely where they are needed for the rooms inside, dictated by function and the quality of light. This was a tectonic shift in architectural thinking. For the first time, the life lived inside the house was given absolute priority over the appearance of the house from the outside. The exterior was no longer a mask. It was a direct expression of the internal logic. This human-centric approach would become a cornerstone of modern architecture, but it was here, in this medieval-inspired fantasy, that the seed was planted. The entire exterior, then, was a carefully coded message. It spoke of honesty, of a connection to a deeper English past, and of a new priority for human life over artificial rules of design. It was a fortress built not of stone, but of principles. The question is, what kind of social mechanism was this fortress designed to protect and operate within its walls? To understand the social mechanism this fortress was built to protect, one must pass through its pointed archway and step inside. For it is here, in the arrangement of rooms and the flow of space, that the true revolution was meant to take place. The exterior was a statement. The interior was the new world itself. A typical wealthy Victorian home was a social cage, a rigid maze of corridors and designated rooms designed to enforce separation. There were formal spaces for guests and private spaces for family, male domains like the study and female domains like the morning room, and a completely separate, often invisible world for the servants. Life was a set of prescribed rituals performed in prescribed boxes. Red House was designed to shatter this cage. The layout is surprisingly open, encouraging a natural flow between the main living areas. It was built for community and conversation, not for stiff formality. This was a space where the artist, the client, the wife, and the friend could coexist and interact in a way that was almost unthinkable in the stratified society outside its walls. But the most radical social statement is found in what is missing: the hidden servants' corridor. In a standard Victorian house, servants were meant to be ghosts, moving through back passages to perform their duties unseen. At Red House, this architectural segregation was eliminated. Their rooms were larger and better lit than was typical, and they used the same hallways as the family. This was a deliberate, ideological choice, to acknowledge the shared humanity of everyone living under one roof. The house's internal logic is further enforced by Webb's revolutionary use of built-in furniture. Massive settles, cupboards, and sideboards are not freestanding objects placed in a room. They are integral parts of the architecture itself. This creates a sense of profound unity and permanence. The house was not a container for possessions. It was a complete, self-contained environment for living. The walls themselves were not allowed to be passive surfaces. They became the pages of a storybook, a canvas for the myths that fueled the Pre-Raphaelite imagination. Murals depicting scenes from Arthurian legend, the Trojan War, and the Bible were planned for every major room. This was an attempt to live inside the art, to make the foundational stories of their culture a constant, physical presence in their daily lives. And at the heart of the main drawing room, the ideological engine of the entire project is carved above the fireplace. Ars longa, vita brevis. Life is short, art is eternal. This was not mere decoration. It was the house's operating manual, a constant reminder of the mission. The home was a tool, a machine designed to facilitate the creation of lasting art in the short time allotted to them. The interior was a total environment, a machine engineered not just for shelter, but to constantly reinforce a set of beliefs about community, labor, and art. This machine meticulously controlled the life within its walls. But the utopian vision demanded control over not just the man-made interior, but the natural world that pressed in from every side. The utopian vision demanded control over not just the man-made interior, but the natural world that pressed in from every side. The Victorian approach to gardening was often one of colonial conquest, bending nature to man's will, displaying exotic specimens torn from the far corners of the empire in rigidly formal beds. Morris's approach was entirely different. His garden was not an opponent to be tamed, but a partner to be woven into the very fabric of the house. The core principle was integration. Morris insisted that the garden be designed to clothe the house, to act as a living, breathing extension of the architecture itself. The design, conceived by Morris and Webb together, was a direct homage to the medieval hortus conclusus, the enclosed garden. It was imagined as a series of outdoor rooms, each with its own character and purpose. The space was divided into 4 distinct square plots, but the walls of these rooms were not brick or stone. They were trellises, forming living fences of climbing roses. This created a sense of structure without imposing a deadening formality. It was an ordered space, but the order was organic, fragrant, and alive. This was not a garden for mere display, it was a garden to be lived in. The choice of plants was a deliberate rejection of Victorian exoticism. The beds were filled with traditional sensory English flowers and herbs: lavender, rosemary, lilies, and irises. Climbers like jasmine, honeysuckle, and passion flower were strategically planted to swarm the brick walls, softening their edges and physically blurring the boundary between the built and the grown. This was the clothing Morris envisioned, a fragrant tapestry wrapping the house. And at the center of the courtyard, the symbolic heart of this self-sufficient world, stood the well. It was not a mere picturesque feature. It was a functional source of water essential to the household. But its design, a deep shaft covered by a dramatic, conical tiled roof that echoed the main house, elevated it into a powerful architectural statement. It was the anchor of the entire estate, reinforcing the image of a self-contained medieval manor, a world unto itself. The garden, therefore, was the final layer of control. It was an aesthetic and practical filter between the house and the encroaching world. It provided beauty, fragrance, and a sense of historical continuity. It completed the creation of a total environment, a meticulously crafted stage. The question that remained was how life itself would be performed upon this stage. What rituals would fill these exquisitely designed spaces? The rituals that filled these exquisitely designed spaces were not the stiff, formal ceremonies of Victorian high society. They were a chaotic, vibrant, and utterly new blend of medieval fantasy, artistic labor, and bohemian camaraderie. For 5 golden years, Red House became the undisputed center of the Pre-Raphaelite universe, the gravitational core around which the brightest talents of the age revolved. The social calendar was anchored by the Sunday gatherings. These were open house affairs where friends would descend from London to escape the city's grime and enter Morris's world. The guest list was a roll call of the avant-garde, the Burne-Joneses, the Rossettis, Ford Madox Brown, the poet Algernon Charles Swinburne. They would spend the days in conversation, playing boisterous games of bowls on the lawn and, above all, collaborating on the house itself. This was a new Camelot, a fellowship of the brush and the pen. But this idyllic image of leisurely weekends is only half the story. It conceals the relentless, almost manic energy that defined the daily routine. The house was not a country retreat for a gentleman of leisure. It was a humming workshop. During the week, Morris was not relaxing. He was engaged in a constant, furious cycle of creation, designing his first wallpapers, experimenting with embroidery, and wrestling with the practical challenges of building a new aesthetic from the ground up. This fusion of life and work was made complete by the arrival of family. It was here, within these walls, that Morris's 2 daughters, Jenny and May, were born. The house was now more than an artistic statement. It was a home, a cradle for a new generation that was meant to grow up untouched by the ugliness of the modern world. The project had taken on the weight of a dynastic ambition. The intensity of this period was staggering. Life, art, family, and business were not separate spheres. They were completely, inextricably fused. The collaborative decoration of the house was the informal research and development that led directly to the founding of the firm. The playful experiments with stained glass became commercial products. Red House was both the sanctuary and the factory, the dream and the engine of its own potential commodification. We must look at this picture with a detective's eye. This constant flurry of creation, this fusion of a family home with a social club and a commercial workshop, was it truly a paradise, or was it an incubator for burnout? The pressure to live up to the ideal, to constantly perform this new, beautiful way of life, must have been immense. The earthly paradise demanded perpetual motion, and this entire grand performance, the art, the family, the fellowship, required fuel. It ran on an engine that remained invisible to the weekend guests, humming silently beneath the floorboards. An engine of immense wealth, with a very specific and deeply paradoxical origin. So let us speak of that engine, the one that powered this paradise. Its origin is not just specific, it is the central, explosive paradox of William Morris's entire life. An earthly paradise requires capital, and the capital for Red House came from a place that was the very antithesis of everything the house was meant to represent. The official story is simple and respectable. The project, costing a formidable £4,000, was financed by Morris's inheritance. Upon his majority, he came into a considerable income derived from shares his father had wisely invested. On the surface, it is the story of a gentleman of independent means choosing to spend his fortune on art rather than indulgence. But that respectable word, inheritance, is a veil. We must pull it back. The source of the Morris family fortune, the wellspring of this artistic utopia, was a majority shareholding in the Devon Great Consols copper mines. This was not a small, artisanal operation. It was one of the largest and most profitable mining enterprises of the era, an industrial behemoth. Let us be clear about what this means. The money that paid for every honest red brick, every hand-painted tile, and every yard of embroidered fabric was extracted from the earth by the brutal, dehumanizing labor that Morris so publicly detested. While artists painted scenes of medieval romance in the sunlit gardens of Kent, men and boys were working in darkness, risking their lives in the toxic, arsenic-laced tunnels of the mine. This is the central, haunting hypocrisy at the core of the project. The fortress built to stand against the Industrial Revolution was funded entirely by its profits. The escape from the spreading sore of industrialism was bankrolled by one of its most aggressive cancers. Every beam in Red House casts a shadow that stretches all the way to a mine shaft in Devon. The entire project is founded on a contradiction so profound it borders on a tragedy. And this paradox did not end with the house. It was coded into the DNA of the business it spawned. The beautiful, handcrafted goods produced by Morris & Company were a direct response to shoddy, machine-made products. But because they were made by hand, by skilled artisans, they were incredibly expensive. They were luxury goods. And who could afford these luxury goods? Who had the disposable income to furnish their homes with Morris's wallpapers, fabrics, and furniture? It was the new class of wealthy industrialists, the lawyers, the bankers, the factory owners. The very people whose fortunes were made by the system Morris was trying to dismantle. His revolution, intended for all, became a beautiful aesthetic for the ruling class. This was the fatal flaw, the original sin from which the project could never truly escape. The dream was subsidized by a nightmare. The artist was a prince, but his throne was built over a poisoned well. This fundamental instability, this moral and financial contradiction, meant that the earthly paradise was built on a fault line. And when pressure was applied, something had to break. The fault line, once established, was destined to fracture. And break it did, but not in a sudden, dramatic collapse. It was a quiet, internal shattering, a failure not of architecture, but of the human heart. This is the real reason the Red House chapter was closed, and why the official history of William Morris often prefers to skim past it. The story isn't so much forgotten as it has been deliberately eclipsed. History is written by the victors, and in the long arc of Morris's life, his later achievements were monumental victories that cast a convenient shadow over this early, painful defeat. He only lived in the house for 5 years, a brief, feverish dream in a life of 62. His later fame as a world-renowned designer, the founder of the Kelmscott Press, and a pioneering socialist thinker, was so immense that it simply crowded the Red House experiment out of the narrative. But this is a misdirection. The brevity of his stay was not a footnote, it was the story itself. The house did not fail because of time, but because of its central, flawed premise. The core of the utopian dream was not just a beautiful house, but a shared life, a commune of artists living and working together. Morris planned to expand Red House, to build a new wing so that his dearest friend, Edward Burne-Jones, and his family could live with them permanently. This was the project's ultimate test. The second phase of the utopia was about to begin, cementing the fellowship in architecture and daily life. But when Morris presented the plan, Burne-Jones refused. The reasons given were practical, sensible, and utterly devastating. Their young son was ill, and they were reluctant to leave the proximity of London's doctors and society. This refusal was the earthquake. It wasn't a betrayal born of malice, but of the mundane, intractable realities of life. And it shattered the foundational myth of the project. It proved that a shared aesthetic and a deep friendship were not enough to overcome the practical anxieties of health, career, and family. The dream of a resurrected medieval brotherhood died in that moment. With that refusal, the spell was broken. The house was no longer a vessel for a shared future, it was a monument to a failed one. For Morris, the vibrant artist colony instantly became a lonely, oversized family home in a location that was now merely inconvenient. The soul had left the building. The magic had drained away, leaving only the cold, hard arithmetic of its own unsustainability. The cold, hard arithmetic of its own unsustainability began its brutal audit. Once the dream of a commune collapsed, the house was no longer a priceless work of art. It was an expensive, impractical asset. The numbers, which had once been secondary to the vision, now became the only things that mattered. And the numbers told a story of inevitable ruin. First, there was the simple cost of upkeep. Red House was not a standard Victorian villa. It was a unique, handcrafted prototype, and maintaining its bespoke features was a constant drain on resources. This was a financial burden Morris had been willing to bear when the house was the center of his social and creative universe. But for a simple family home, it was an extravagance he could no longer justify. Compounding this was the slow failure of the dirty engine that had financed the dream in the first place. The value of his shares in the Devon Great Consols mine, once a seemingly endless source of wealth, began to decline. The river of money was narrowing to a trickle. The very industrial system that had funded the anti-industrial experiment was now retracting its support, exposing the project's foundational vulnerability. The utopia, it turned out, was subject to market forces. Then there was the daily, grinding cost of the commute. The journey from Kent to the firm's offices in London was not just a financial drain, it was a physical and temporal one. The hours spent on the train were hours not spent designing, managing, or living. The location that had once been a strategic retreat had now become a logistical prison, isolating him from the very business that was meant to be the public extension of the house's ideals. This relentless pressure took its toll on Morris's body. His health began to fail, worn down by the strain of trying to manage two separate lives, the country squire and the city businessman. He was diagnosed with rheumatic fever, and his doctor presented him with a brutal, non-negotiable ultimatum. He could have his work in London, or he could have his house in Kent. He could not have both. The body itself was now enforcing the logic that the heart had tried to deny. For a brief moment, a final, desperate solution was considered. If Morris could not commute to the firm, could the firm commute to him? The idea of moving the entire Morris, Marshall, Faulkner and Cumber workshop to Red House was floated. But it was a logistical fantasy. The firm relied on a network of suppliers, artisans, and clients based in London. Moving it to the countryside would have been commercial suicide. The practical needs of capitalism crushed the last vestiges of the romantic dream. The choice was made for him. The arithmetic was undeniable. In 1865, just 5 years after its triumphant completion, William Morris put Red House up for sale. He moved his family not to another country home, but to a functional apartment above the firm's new showrooms on Queen Square in Bloomsbury. The retreat was total. He was forced to abandon his fortress and move back into the very heart of the spreading sore he had tried to escape, living literally above the shop. The earthly paradise was lost, exchanged for a flat in the city. And what then became of the abandoned relics? The fate of the abandoned relics is a story of profound quiet. When the artist and his fellowship departed, the Palace of Arts did not crumble. It simply fell silent. The house entered a long period of hibernation, passing through the hands of a series of private owners for more than a century. It became once again just a house, a strange, beautiful, but ultimately domestic shell, its revolutionary purpose fading into local legend. This long sleep was, in a way, its salvation. Because it was continuously inhabited, it was never allowed to fall into ruin. Its subsequent owners lived their lives within its walls, sometimes altering it, often covering the radical art with more conventional decorations, but never fundamentally violating the architectural body created by Webb. The structure, the bones of the dream, remained miraculously intact, waiting. The awakening came in 2003. In a crucial act of national preservation, the house was acquired by the National Trust and finally opened to the public. The doors, once closed to all but Morris's inner circle, were now open to the world. The investigation could finally begin in earnest. Conservators and historians descended upon the site not as guests, but as archaeologists, ready to sift through the evidence of a lost civilization. And the first thing they confronted was the scale of the loss. The crime scene, if you will, had been picked clean of its most valuable evidence. Most of the original, freestanding furniture, the very pieces that had helped launch the firm, was gone. Morris had taken it with him in his retreat to London. The great painted wardrobe, the embroidered hangings, the hand-knotted carpets, the portable soul of the house had been evacuated, scattered to other homes, and eventually to museums. What does it mean for a body to survive if its spirit has been removed? But not all the evidence could be removed. The clues baked into the structure itself remained. The massive, built-in settles and cabinets designed by Webb were still there, immovable testaments to the original vision of integrated design. Stained glass windows, created by Burne-Jones, still cast their jeweled light across the floors, and fragments of the great mural scheme, though damaged and incomplete, still clung to the walls. These were the fingerprints of the Fellowship, waiting to be read. Then, in 2013, came the breakthrough. It was a discovery that sent a shockwave through the world of art history, a moment of pure detective story revelation. While carefully working in what had been Morris and Jane's bedroom, conservators began to peel back the layers of wallpaper and paint that had been applied over the decades. And beneath it all, a ghost emerged from the plaster. It was a vast, previously unknown mural, a complete narrative cycle depicting biblical scenes, clearly designed by Morris and executed with the unmistakable hand of Edward Burne-Jones and others. Here was the Fellowship, their collaboration made manifest, hidden from view for almost 150 years. Why was it covered? Was it unfinished when Morris left? Or was it simply wallpapered over by later residents who had no idea of the treasure they were concealing? The discovery proved that Red House still held its secrets. And what of the house's creator? He never set foot in it again. After the sale in 1865, William Morris never returned. When asked why, his answer was simple and heartbreaking. He said that it would be too emotional for him. This was not the wistful nostalgia of an old man for his first home. This was the deep, scarring pain of a man confronting the monument to his own greatest failure. To return would have been to walk through the rooms of a future that never happened, to see the ghost of the perfect, collaborative life he had envisioned and lost. The house had become a tomb for his youthful idealism. He could not bear to visit the grave. The building stands, a silent witness, but the survival of the brick is not the same as the survival of the lesson. The survival of the brick is not the same as the survival of the lesson. And the lesson of Red House is perhaps the most important and most painful thing that William Morris ever built. It is a story so vital for our own time that its preservation is not a matter of historical curiosity, but one of urgent necessity. This investigation reveals a timeless, brutal truth about the eternal conflict between the perfect utopian dream and the deeply flawed, inconvenient engine of reality. The dream was not slain by a great evil or a dramatic betrayal. It was bled to death by 1,000 tiny cuts. It was defeated by the mundane. The earthly paradise was undone by train schedules and dwindling share prices. The fellowship of artists was broken apart by a child's illness and a wife's desire to stay close to the city. The great war against industrial ugliness was lost to the simple, intractable problems of a bad commute and the rising cost of living. This is the central, devastating lesson. Our most beautiful ideals are incredibly fragile. They are not tested on grand philosophical battlefields, but in the muddy trenches of everyday life. A revolution in aesthetics means nothing if you cannot afford to pay the staff who maintain it. A perfect community is a fantasy if it cannot accommodate the messy, unpredictable, and sometimes selfish needs of the human beings who are meant to inhabit it. And this is why Red House is more than a museum. It is a mirror. It forces us to confront the central paradox of our own attempts to live better, more authentic lives. We see its story reflected in the startup founder who preaches a gospel of a humane work family while being funded by ruthless venture capital. We see it in the activist who fights for environmental purity while relying on the very technologies and supply chains that pollute the planet. We are all, in some way, living in our own version of Red House, trying to build something pure with compromised materials. The investigation exposes the uncomfortable truth of the dirty engine. Red House teaches us that we must always interrogate the foundations of our ideals. Where does the money come from? What unseen labor supports our beautiful vision? What ethical compromises are we making just below the surface? It serves as a permanent warning that a utopia built on a foundation of hypocrisy is built on sand. Sooner or later, the tide will come in. But the lesson is not that we should stop dreaming. That is the simple, cynical conclusion, and it is the wrong one. The true lesson is that beauty and creativity require more than just inspiration. They demand a fierce and unforgiving pragmatism. A dream needs more than a manifesto. It needs a sustainable business model. A revolution requires not just poets and painters, but accountants and project managers. Art may be eternal, but its survival on this earth depends entirely on logistics. For those who wish to conduct their own investigations, the evidence is now accessible. The primary crime scene, Red House itself, is under the meticulous care of the National Trust in the UK, its archives holding the architectural and personal histories. The business records of the revolution it spawned, the documents of Morris and Cousy, are preserved for public scrutiny at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. The clues are there, waiting for those willing to look. These deep dives into the past are not easy. They require time, resources, and your support. If you believe these forgotten stories need to be told, that these cold cases of history deserve to be reopened, then help us continue the investigation. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and most importantly, tell us in the comments what we should investigate next. What grand project, what forgotten dynasty, what architectural ghost is hiding a story that needs to be brought into the light? History only survives when we refuse to let it be forgotten.